Elizabeth Crawford started building a tiny cabin, just 12 feet by 14 feet, in Montana Territory in late October 1884. And when her neighbors realized the 31-year-old widow was planning to construct shelter during the approaching winter, instead of waiting until spring like any sensible person would, they laughed at what seemed like desperate foolishness that would end in failure and possibly death. Not just poor timing, suicidal timing. Because everyone knew you built cabins in summer when weather cooperated and materials were workable. You didn't start construction in late October with winter weeks away. Wood became brittle in cold. Your hands couldn't work effectively in freezing temperatures. Snow and ice would halt construction before you finished. Building during winter was asking to be caught with incomplete shelter when deadly cold arrived. A widow, alone, starting construction when she should be preparing to survive winter in existing shelter. People didn't just think it would fail. They thought Elizabeth was going to die from exposure, trying something impossible. Elizabeth Crawford had come to Montana Territory in 1881 with her husband William and their infant daughter Sarah. William had been a surveyor with steady work and good prospects. They'd lived in rented quarters in town, adequate housing but expensive, consuming too much of William's income. William had died in 1883 from typhoid fever. Sarah had died 3 months later from the same disease. Elizabeth, at 31, found herself alone with some savings, no family, and the choice between returning east to relatives who disapproved of her frontier marriage or finding a way to survive independently. She chose independence. She had approximately $80 saved, enough to buy land and materials for basic shelter, but not enough for both land and paying someone to build a cabin. If Elizabeth wanted property and a home, she'd have to build the cabin herself. The conventional approach would be to buy land in spring, build during summer, and move in by fall. But Elizabeth didn't have housing until spring. Renting through winter would consume $20 she needed for construction materials. She'd be trapped in a cycle of renting and never accumulating resources for her own place. Elizabeth made a calculated decision. Buy land immediately, start building in late October, work through early winter, and complete enough shelter to move in before deadly cold arrived. It was risky, it violated conventional wisdom, but it was the only path to independence with her limited resources. When Elizabeth filed her land claim in late October 1884, 80 acres on a slight southern-facing slope with good water access, and announced she'd be building immediately, the reaction was swift and harsh. "Elizabeth, you can't build a cabin in winter," Robert Hayes, the land office clerk, said bluntly. "It's nearly November. First serious snow could come any day. You'll be caught with half-built shelter and freeze to death." "I'll build small and fast. A tiny cabin I can complete in 3 weeks if I work efficiently." 3 weeks! Even experienced builders take 6 weeks for a small cabin in good weather. You're a woman alone with no construction experience trying to build during approaching winter. This isn't brave, it's suicidal. But Elizabeth had already calculated everything. A 12 by 14-foot cabin, 168 square feet, was large enough for a single person living efficiently. Small size meant less material, less labor, faster completion. She'd use simple construction, log walls, flat roof instead of peaked to save time, minimal interior finishing. She bought materials immediately, 12 logs for walls at $2 each, $24 total. Boards for floor and roof, $30, door and window, $8, stove, $12, various hardware and supplies, $6. Total, $80, exactly her savings. Elizabeth started construction October 28, 1884. She had 3 weeks, maybe 4 if weather cooperated, before winter made outdoor work impossible. The work was immediately more difficult than anticipated. Elizabeth had watched construction, but never built anything herself. Notching logs to fit corners required precision she didn't have. Her first attempts were clumsy, leaving gaps. Moving logs into position required strength she barely possessed. She developed a technique using ropes and leverage, but each log took hours to position. Her hands became destroyed from rope burns and splinters within days. Her back developed constant pain from lifting and positioning heavy materials. She lost weight rapidly from the physical exertion and inadequate time for meal preparation. Neighbors who saw her working expressed concern mixed with mockery. "Elizabeth is trying to build a cabin," people said in town. "Starting in late October, alone, with winter coming. She'll be dead before Christmas." Sarah Mitchell, a ranch wife who'd been friendly, came to Elizabeth's property on November 3rd to attempt an intervention. "Elizabeth, I understand you want your own place, but this is madness. You're trying to build during winter. Your cabin is tiny, barely bigger than a storage shed. You're working alone without experience. Please stop this before you hurt yourself or worse. Rent through winter and build properly in spring." "I can't afford rent and materials both. This is my only path to having my own place." "Then wait another year. Save more money. Don't risk your life trying to build shelter when winter is arriving." "Sarah, I've calculated everything. 3 weeks of work. Small, efficient cabin. Move in before serious cold. I can do this if I work hard." Sarah looked at Elizabeth's rough construction. Poorly notched logs, clumsy work, everything taking much longer than it should. "Even if you finish, which I doubt, this tiny cabin will be inadequate. You'll freeze in winter in a structure this small with your amateur construction." But Elizabeth kept building. November brought cold, but no major snow. She worked 12-hour days, fighting her inexperience and physical limitations. The cabin walls rose slowly, 4 logs high by November 7th, 6 logs by November 12th. On November 15th, the first snow came, 3 inches overnight. Elizabeth woke in her rented room in town to the reality that winter had begun, and her cabin walls were only 8 logs high, not yet at full height for walls, with no roof yet. She rode to her property through the snow, uncertain whether to continue or abandon the project. Standing at the partially built cabin, walls chest-high open to sky, looking tiny and inadequate, Elizabeth faced the question, keep building in worsening weather or accept failure. She thought about the alternative. Years of renting, never accumulating enough to build, growing older without security or independence. The risk of continuing was death from exposure. The cost of stopping was giving up everything she'd worked toward. Elizabeth decided to continue, but she modified the plan. Originally, she'd intended full log walls to ceiling height, approximately 7 feet. Now she'd compromise, finish walls at 6 feet to reduce work, accept a low ceiling for faster completion. The next week was brutal. Elizabeth worked in cold that made her hands nearly useless. She wore every piece of warm clothing she owned and still shivered constantly. The logs were harder to work in cold. The wood was brittle. Her tools felt awkward in numb hands. By November 22nd, she had walls complete at 6 feet, lower than planned but adequate. Now came the roof. Elizabeth's decision to use a flat roof instead of peaked suddenly proved crucial. A flat roof required much less carpentry skill and much less time. She laid boards across the walls and covered them with tar paper and sod for weatherproofing. The work was desperate and clumsy. The roof wasn't beautiful. It was rough boards covered in tar paper with sod thrown on top. But it was weatherproof. By November 27th, 29 days after starting, Elizabeth had a completed structure. 12 by 14 feet, 6-foot walls, flat roof, 1 door, 1 window, dirt floor. It looked terrible. The logs were poorly notched with visible gaps that Elizabeth had chinked with mud and moss. The chinking was clumsy but functional. The roof sagged slightly in the middle from imperfect support beam placement. The door hung slightly crooked because Elizabeth's hinge installation wasn't perfectly level. The single window was positioned off-center. because she'd cut the opening before measuring carefully. The whole structure screamed amateur construction done in desperate haste, but it had 4 walls, a roof, a door that closed, and a window that let in light. Elizabeth stood inside her completed cabin on November 27th, the day before the first major storm was predicted, and felt overwhelming relief. She'd done something everyone said was impossible. She'd built shelter during winter when conventional wisdom said construction couldn't happen. The cabin measured exactly what she'd planned, 12 feet by 14 feet internally after wall thickness. 6-foot ceilings meant she could stand upright in the center, but had to duck slightly near the walls, where the flat roof sloped imperceptibly. 168 square feet of floor space held a small stove in one corner, a narrow bed along one wall, a small table with 1 chair, storage shelves, and minimal open space. It was cramped, it was crude, but it was hers. Elizabeth moved in November 28th, carrying her few possessions from her rented room in town. She installed her small stove, purchased new with her last dollars, the one expensive item she'd allowed herself. She arranged her furniture. She swept the dirt floor and covered it with canvas she'd saved from the construction tarp. By evening she had a fire going and the cabin warming. The first night in her own shelter was profound. Elizabeth lay in her narrow bed, looking at the crude log walls she'd built with her own hands, and understood she'd achieved something remarkable. She owned land. She owned a home. She owed nothing to anyone. At 31, widowed and alone on the frontier, she'd created security through determination and work that violated every rule of conventional timing. But the real test hadn't come yet. Would her tiny amateur cabin actually keep her alive through Montana winter? Neighbors who saw the completed cabin were unanimous in their assessment. Elizabeth had wasted her money building something inadequate that would never keep her warm through Montana winter. "It's a shed, not a cabin," became the common description. People rode by Elizabeth's property to see the structure that had been built in winter, and everyone agreed it looked like storage space, not human housing. Robert Hayes, who'd warned her against building in winter, came to see the finished structure on December 1st. He walked around the outside, examining the construction with a critical eye. "Elizabeth, you built something. I'll give you credit for determination and courage. You started in late October when I said it was impossible, and you finished before serious winter. That's remarkable." "Thank you, Robert. But I need to be honest with you. This isn't adequate shelter for Montana winter. Look at this chinking. It's rough and there are gaps. This roof sags and the tar paper already has tears. The door doesn't seal properly, and most critically, the size is too small. 168 square feet with 6-foot ceilings. You're going to feel like you're living in a box, and worse, you're going to freeze because there's not enough space for heat to develop and circulate. Small size should heat more efficiently, not less." Robert shook his head. "That's not how it works. Cabins need adequate volume for heat circulation. Too small, and you'll have cold spots and inadequate warmth. Elizabeth, you've worked incredibly hard and shown remarkable determination, but I'm genuinely worried you've built a death trap. Please, rent a room in town for winter and use this as storage until you can build properly in spring." "I have no money left for rent. This cabin is my only option." Robert's expression showed genuine concern mixed with pity. "Then please promise me you'll come to town if the cold becomes dangerous. Pride isn't worth your life. If this cabin fails to keep you warm, which I believe it will, abandon it and seek help. Don't die out here trying to prove something." Elizabeth promised she'd be sensible, knowing she had no intention of abandoning her cabin unless it truly became lethal. The early December cold, 8 below zero, proved the cabin worked adequately, maintaining 58 degrees. But Elizabeth didn't publicize this success. She knew one modest cold snap wasn't proof, and she knew people wouldn't believe her anyway. They'd seen the crude construction. They'd made up their minds the cabin was inadequate. As December progressed, temperatures dropped further. Elizabeth developed routines for maximum efficiency. She kept her small stove burning continuously at moderate levels rather than letting it go out and restarting. This maintained steady warmth with less wood than cycling hot and cold. She kept her bed near the stove for warmth at night. She cooked simple one-pot meals that provided heat while preparing food. She sealed the door and window at night with cloth to prevent drafts. The cabin that looked terrible actually functioned remarkably well. The flat sod roof, which everyone said was crude, provided excellent insulation. The thick layer of earth absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. The southern exposure, which Elizabeth had chosen more by luck than planning, meant winter sun hit her front wall and provided passive solar warming. The small window, which looked inadequate for light, actually reduced heat loss compared to larger windows. The low ceiling, which made the space feel cramped, meant heat didn't rise far before encountering the roof and radiating back down. Every flaw that critics pointed to actually worked in Elizabeth's favor. The crude construction was accidentally good design for heating efficiency. Elizabeth's neighbors, meanwhile, were discovering that conventional cabins had serious problems during sustained cold. Large spaces required massive firewood consumption. High-peak ceilings wasted heat in the upper volume where nobody lived. Large windows lost substantial heat. Complex construction created gaps where wind infiltrated. The structures that looked proper and felt spacious became expensive, drafty, and difficult to heat. By late December, Elizabeth was burning approximately 1 log every 3 hours, 8 logs per day, to maintain 60 to 65 degrees in her cabin. Her neighbors with conventional 16 by 20 cabins were burning 30 to 40 logs per day and achieving 50 to 55 degrees. Elizabeth's cabin was 4 times more efficient and warmer, but she stayed quiet. She knew extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof, and December cold, however uncomfortable for others, wasn't extraordinary enough to convince people who'd already decided her cabin was inadequate. That extraordinary proof came January 9th, when the massive storm system arrived with violence that would kill people and destroy structures. The storm began as light snow around noon, pretty, gentle, not threatening. By 4 in the afternoon, it was heavy snowfall. By 8 that evening, it was a full blizzard with wind strong enough to shake structures and snow so heavy that visibility was measured in feet, not miles. Elizabeth sat in her tiny cabin, listening to the wind howl and watching snow accumulate outside her single small window. She'd prepared carefully, 3 days of firewood stacked inside near the stove, food prepared, water stored. She was as ready as she could be. Inside her cabin, 62 degrees with a moderate fire, comfortable, secure. Elizabeth added 2 logs to her stove and watched the temperature rise to 65. The cabin that everyone said was too small to heat properly was heating so efficiently that she had to moderate the fire to avoid overheating. The 6-foot ceilings everyone said were inadequate meant heat didn't waste energy rising to empty space. The 12 by 14 dimensions everyone said were cramped meant every bit of stove heat stayed in living space. The storm intensified through the night. Wind reached speeds that were tearing roofs off buildings across Montana Territory. Temperature dropped from 20 degrees at sunset to 12 below by midnight, 5 below by 2 a.m., finally reaching 23 below by dawn. Elizabeth slept comfortably in her tiny cabin. The flat sod roof meant wind couldn't get underneath and lift it like peaked roofs. The low profile meant wind mostly flowed over the structure. The small size meant minimal surface area for cold to attack. The crude chinking that looked amateurish actually sealed adequately, because Elizabeth had been thorough even if not skilled. January 10th dawned with the storm still raging. Elizabeth woke to her cabin at 60 degrees. The fire had burned down overnight, But the insulated tiny space retained heat effectively. She added wood, made coffee, prepared breakfast, and settled in to wait out the storm. 2 miles away, Sarah Mitchell's family was in crisis. Their conventional cabin, 16 by 20 feet with peaked roof and 8-foot ceilings, required desperate amounts of firewood to heat. They'd burned through 2 days of wood supply in the first night trying to maintain barely adequate temperature. John Mitchell had ventured outside at dawn, despite lethal conditions, trying to reach their firewood shed 50 feet from the cabin. The journey should have taken 2 minutes. In the blizzard, with 23 below temperature and violent wind, it became a near-death experience. John made it to the shed, loaded his arms with wood, and started back. Halfway to the cabin, he became disoriented in the whiteout conditions. He couldn't see the cabin. He couldn't see anything. For terrifying minutes, he wandered in circles, arms full of wood, temperature killing him, before finally spotting the cabin door. Inside, John discovered frostbite on both hands. The wood he'd been carrying had frozen his fingers. The firewood he'd risked his life to retrieve would last maybe 4 hours before they'd need more. Their large cabin was consuming wood so fast that John would have to make the deadly journey repeatedly, and eventually he'd fail and die. Sarah looked at her husband's frost-bitten hands, her 2 children huddled near the fireplace, crying from cold despite heavy clothing, and made a decision. She'd seen smoke from Elizabeth Crawford's tiny cabin earlier. If Elizabeth was alive, if her supposedly inadequate shed was actually keeping her alive, maybe she could help. Sarah bundled up in every piece of warm clothing she owned and told John she was going to Elizabeth's cabin. John, with frostbitten hands unable to work, couldn't stop her. Sarah opened the door into the blizzard and started walking toward where she believed Elizabeth's cabin should be. The quarter-mile journey was a nightmare. Sarah couldn't see more than a few feet. Wind knocked her down twice. Snow was waist-deep in drifts. Temperature was so cold that her face felt like it was burning despite wrapping. She walked for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes, terrified she'd become lost and die within sight of help. And then she saw it, a small, dark shape, barely visible through the white chaos. Elizabeth's tiny cabin, low and solid, smoke rising from the chimney. Sarah stumbled to the door and pounded with numb hands. That proof came in January 1885, when a massive snowstorm struck Montana Territory with violence that would test every structure and person in the region. It started January 9th as light snow. By evening, it was heavy snowfall with rising wind. By midnight, it was a full blizzard with wind strong enough to damage structures and snow, falling so heavily that visibility was 0. Elizabeth woke January 10th to a cabin that was shaking slightly from wind but felt secure and warm. Through her one small window she could see nothing but white. The storm that people had feared was here. Inside her tiny cabin, 62 degrees with a moderate fire in her small stove, genuinely comfortable. The cabin's tiny size meant it heated easily despite the storm. The flat sod roof meant no wind could get underneath and lift it like peaked roofs. The low profile meant wind mostly flowed over the structure instead of slamming into high walls. The southern exposure was buried in snow, but the door was sheltered. Elizabeth added wood to her stove, 2 small logs, and the cabin temperature rose to 65 degrees. She had food, water, firewood, and secure shelter. She could wait out the storm in complete safety. 2 miles away, Sarah Mitchell was fighting a losing battle to keep her family safe in their conventional cabin. Sarah's cabin was well built, 16 by 20 feet, peaked roof, good construction by experienced builders. But during the storm, size became a liability. The cabin's interior volume, approximately 2,200 cubic feet, required massive amounts of firewood to heat. The peaked roof created high ceilings that wasted heat. The large size meant heat dispersed before warming the space adequately. Sarah's family burned wood desperately, trying to maintain 50 degrees. They wore heavy coats indoors and huddled near the fireplace. The children were crying from cold. Sarah's husband, John, was outside in lethal conditions, trying to bring more firewood from the shed. Risking his life for fuel, their large cabin consumed voraciously. The storm continued for 3 days. Temperature dropped to 23 below zero. Wind sustained at speeds that tore roofs off buildings and knocked down anyone who ventured outside. Snow accumulated to depths that buried smaller structures completely. Elizabeth stayed in her tiny cabin in comfort and safety the entire time. She used approximately 1 log every 2 hours, 6 logs per day, maintaining 60 to 65 degrees. She read, prepared meals, stayed warm. The storm outside was killing people and destroying structures, but inside her 12 by 14-foot cabin, Elizabeth was perfectly fine. On the 3rd day, January 12th, Elizabeth heard pounding on her door. She opened it to find Sarah Mitchell, frost-covered and exhausted, having made a desperate 1/4-mile journey through the blizzard. "Elizabeth, please, I need help. Our cabin is out of firewood. John went to the shed and hasn't returned. The children are crying from cold. I saw smoke from your cabin and thought I didn't know where else to go." Elizabeth pulled Sarah inside immediately. The contrast was shocking. Sarah went from 23 below with howling wind to 65 degrees and perfect calm. Sarah collapsed, overwhelmed by warmth after hours of cold. Elizabeth gave Sarah hot soup and wrapped her in blankets. Sarah sat in the tiny cabin that everyone had mocked and tried to process what was happening. "Your cabin is warm. Elizabeth, your tiny cabin, the one we all said was inadequate, is genuinely warm while my family is freezing in our proper cabin built by experienced builders. The small size heats efficiently, small stove, small space, minimal heat loss. We're burning through firewood desperately and barely reaching 50 degrees. You're comfortable using how much wood?" "About 6 logs per day, maintaining 65 degrees. Sarah's face showed shock. "6 logs per day? We're burning that much every 2 hours and still freezing. Your amateur shed built in winter is 10 times more efficient than our proper cabin." The storm continued through the night. Elizabeth shared her cabin with Sarah, both women sleeping comfortably in the tiny space. The next morning, when wind finally decreased enough for travel, Elizabeth and Sarah made their way to Sarah's cabin. What they found was a family in severe distress. John had made it back from the shed but had frostbite on both hands. The children were hypothermic despite being indoors. The cabin was 48 degrees with no wood left to burn. They'd consumed their entire winter supply in 3 days, trying to heat the large space. Elizabeth immediately organized rescue. She brought Sarah's family back to her tiny cabin, 7 people total crammed into 168 square feet. It was crowded beyond belief, but it was warm. Elizabeth's small stove maintained 60 degrees even with 7 people, using only slightly more wood than when she'd been alone. Sarah's family stayed in Elizabeth's cabin for 2 days while the storm cleared and they organized new firewood supply. The children recovered from hypothermia. John's frostbite healed without permanent damage. They'd survived only because Elizabeth's inadequate shed had been warm enough to shelter 7 people when their proper cabin had failed catastrophically. When the storm finally ended January 14th, the damage across Montana Territory was severe. 9 people had died from exposure, some trying to reach shelter, others from hypothermia in inadequate buildings. Dozens of structures were damaged or destroyed. Large conventional cabins had consumed entire winter firewood supplies in 3 days of desperate heating. And Elizabeth Crawford's tiny 12 by 14-foot cabin, built in late October by an inexperienced widow, mocked as a shed, dismissed as inadequate, had kept 7 people warm and safe through conditions that killed people in structures everyone considered proper. Word spread rapidly. People came to see the tiny cabin that had outperformed conventional construction. Elizabeth explained the advantages. Small size, heated efficiently, flat sod roof insulated well, low ceiling retained heat. Compact volume meant minimal firewood consumption. Robert Hayes stood in Elizabeth's cabin, crowded with 3 visitors but still comfortably warm, and had to acknowledge how wrong he'd been. "Elizabeth, I told you this cabin was a death trap. I said you'd freeze in this tiny amateur construction. I was completely wrong. Your cabin works better than structures 3 times larger, built by experienced carpenters. You succeeded where I was certain you'd fail." Over the following months, 7 people approached Elizabeth, asking about building small, efficient cabins. Elizabeth shared her experience. Build small, use flat roofs for easier construction and better insulation, keep ceilings low, choose southern exposure, prioritize heating efficiency over size. Not everyone who tried succeeded. Thomas Peterson built a small cabin but used a peaked roof. The extra height made heating difficult. Margaret Wilson built small but made it 14 by 18 feet. The larger size lost efficiency advantages, but those who followed Elizabeth's specific approach, truly tiny size, around 12 by 14 feet, flat, heavily insulated roof, low ceilings, southern exposure, built cabins that heated remarkably efficiently. The economic impact was significant. Elizabeth calculated she used 75% less firewood than conventional cabins per winter. Her cabin required 0 maintenance. The flat sod roof was stable and weatherproof, and the small size meant she'd built it for $80 total. Conventional cabins cost $300 or more. The tiny cabin also had unexpected advantages. The compact size meant Elizabeth could clean and maintain everything in minutes. The single room meant efficient use of space, everything within reach, no wasted hallways or separate rooms. And the small stove that heated the cabin also cooked meals efficiently. Some people never accepted tiny cabins as legitimate housing. They insisted proper homes needed size, regardless of efficiency. But for single people, elderly folks, and anyone with limited resources, Elizabeth's accidentally innovative design offered practical advantages conventional cabins couldn't match. What Elizabeth had discovered was a principle formal building science would later confirm. Heating requirements increase exponentially with volume, and below certain sizes, tiny structures achieve remarkable efficiency. Modern tiny house movement uses these same principles: small volume, efficient heating, minimal resource consumption. Elizabeth lived in her 12 by 14 cabin for 6 years until 1890, when she married and moved to a larger home with her new husband. But she never forgot that her tiny shed had saved her life and the lives of Sarah's family during the storm that killed 9 people in proper cabins. Sarah Mitchell built a small cabin herself in 1886, 12 by 16 feet, flat roof, southern exposure. Her family used it as a winter retreat, finding it far warmer and more efficient than their large main cabin. Other families adopted similar patterns, keeping large cabins for summer living, building tiny, efficient cabins for winter warmth. By 1888, winter cabins based on Elizabeth's design were common enough that land office clerks recommended them to single settlers and families wanting efficient heating. Elizabeth Crawford built a tiny cabin during approaching winter, when everyone laughed and said she'd die trying something impossible. They mocked the 12 by 14 shed built by an inexperienced widow and said it was inadequate amateur construction. Then the storm came with 3 days of 23 below and violent wind, and Elizabeth's tiny cabin stayed 65 degrees, while conventional cabins consumed entire winter wood supplies, barely reaching 50 degrees. The shed, that was supposed to be a death trap, saved 7 people when proper structures failed. The amateur construction done in desperate haste proved more efficient than experienced carpentry. The timing everyone said was suicidal was actually the only path to independence. Elizabeth didn't know she was pioneering tiny house efficiency principles. She just knew she needed shelter she could afford and build herself. and conventional approaches weren't possible with her limited resources and skills. The tiny cabin stood until 1903, when it was finally dismantled. By then, its efficiency principles were understood and copied across Montana Territory. Elizabeth Crawford knew in 1884 what building science would later confirm. Sometimes the smallest solution is the one that actually works best.